Hello and welcome to another lecture in the Abralim ao Vivo series. Abralim ao Vivo is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. The purpose of the series is to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussion on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language. Today, I'd like to introduce Professor Joseph Halshecker. He's a professor of neuroscience, director of the Laboratory of Integrative Neuroscience and Cognition at Georgetown University. The title of his lecture today is Where Did the Language Come From? Precursor Mechanisms in Non-Human Primates. Questions and comments are very welcome in the chat. Please join me and welcome Professor Halshecker. Thank you.
Yes, hello. Hello, Brazil. And I'm so very honored by this invitation to give that lecture today. And been very excited to visit Brazil for the second time in my life, even though not in person, unfortunately. We're all still battling this terrible pandemic. And I know Brazil has been affected quite a bit. I'm also grateful to my discussant, who you will see later, I guess. Maybe you'll see her right now. I don't know how to arrange with it. Ina Bornkessel-Jozewski, who is doing this all the way from Australia and Adelaide, to be more precise. And Ina told me it's 2:30 in the morning for her, so I really admire her to stay awake all that long. And I hope we'll have some fun together and we'll have a good discussion following my talk. So I'm especially honored to give this lecture because I'm not a linguist by any means. And I sort of have been interested in language all of my life. And when I was a student in Germany, I was going to linguistics lectures every now and then, but when I had time. My wife was a student of the languages, and so I sneaked in with her in some of the lectures. And I read Chomsky, of course, and Lyons. I don't know if anybody still reads that introduction of linguistics. And then was reading about Sapir and Worf and Polishin and Fodor, So this was sort of my early experience. And then I became an engineering student, medical student, and but language never left me. It's sort of a fascinating topic and one of the most fascinating in the human sciences, I think. You probably agree with me. And I came across that book by Fodor, Modularity of Mind, at a time in the 1980s when brain sciences also were kind of coming back to the idea that the brain consists of different modules that do different things, functional specialization, although that had been suggested 100 years earlier. And Fodor was, of course, not a brain scientist. He was a cognitive scientist and thought in more abstract terms. And I was an engineer, and I was, hoping to understand the hardware of the brain. And when I was in the late 1980s visiting the Salk Institute and had a little bit of interaction with the people there, Francis Crick was around, and he was a very influential person. Even though he was a molecular biologist by training, he became interested in neuroscience and in language in particular. But his famous saying was that the trouble with language is that there are no animal models. Now, I think it's true that we still need animal models to understand brain function, the hardware of the brain, so to say. Even though there are imaging techniques now that you can use to study the human brain directly, animal models are still indispensable. But I wasn't quite satisfied with that answer of Francis Crick's, who I knew quite well there, and we had lunch together almost every day. And I was thinking, in terms of evolution, what would Darwin say, how language might have evolved from simpler brains in animals that do not have language, obviously, and don't speak, but they must have had, ways of communication And Darwin, in his famous book, The Descent of Man, said something like, language consists of multiple discrete components. There are your modules again, or subsystems that emerged one at a time and together formed the human language system. So that was sort of the essence of what Darwin was up to. And he definitely thought that this is how it happened. And I kind of agree with him. And I think a lot of people would probably agree that there are subsystems in the human brain that have all evolved from small animal brains. And this is the famous reproduction of Corbin and Brodmann's Lokalisationslehre der Großhirnrinde, just to show off my German, my native language. And the cytotectonic maps that are named after him, Brodmann areas that are still used today in neuroimaging studies. And there you have right in the middle of the brain, the auditory cortex. I guess, can I point with my mouse? And you see my mouse moving here? Areas 41, 42 is what Brodmann called them, primary and secondary auditory cortex. This is where all our spoken language comes into the brain. When we listen to someone talking, when you listen to me now, it comes into your area 41. And then it goes from there into 42, and which is secondary auditory cortex. And ultimately, if you're listening to someone talk, it will land in, among others, Broca's area, which is inferior frontal cortex. And Broca, a neurologist in France in the late 19th century, discovered that area because a patient had a stroke in that region and was unable to speak anymore. And that was, of course, a seminal discovery, because now people knew that this is where language was located, or is it? And there are, of course, as we now know, lots of other regions of the brain that are dealing with language and speech. And I will try to go over some of the findings in the recent decades, last 25 years or so, to see what we can infer about the evolution of that important system. So this is my model that I developed over the last 25 years with the help of a lot of other people in rhesus monkeys. On the right, upper right, is the monkey brain. And on the lower left, this is the model that I developed originally with Sophie Scott, published in 2009. And you can see the similarities there. There's a dual stream going around the brain from starting out in the auditory cortex into a ventral stream and a dorsal stream. That'll become clearer as I talk about it. And Ina, who will discuss some of this with me after my talk, Ina Bornkessel, wrote a paper with me and her husband and a few other authors, where we also elaborated this more specifically towards language. But you'll hear more about this. This is just to set the scene now. Now here is a rhesus monkey. This is our animal that we work on. And of course, monkeys communicate. They make sounds. And they're trying to tell the other monkeys in the colony, what they think about something, about food and about weather, I guess, and other new. But it's not. We wouldn't call this speech or language, would we? So, but it's a vocal communication. It's a form of vocal communication. And of course, the brain sizes, I should have mentioned that earlier, brain sizes they differ between humans and monkeys. The macaque has about a tenth of the weight of his brain compared to the human, but otherwise it's organized pretty much the same way. There is some of the motor cortex, as Penfield in his famous studies described it, with a homunculus. Her body is represented topographically along that central sulcus. If I go back here, there's the central sulcus pointing, the arrows are pointing to it right in the middle of the brain. And that exists in both species. And then we have, through the work of Hubel Wiesel and many others are following them a lot of information about the visual cortex, which is on the other side of the brain, the kind of as you say, the occipital part, the occipital cortex here, back here. And so there's a functional architecture across the brain, and this is what neuroscience has been trying to figure out for the last 50 years now, and we're still in the middle of that, of course. And we'll have to work on this for another 50 years or more. So David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel were some of the pioneers who developed single unit electrophysiology, where we can record from single cells in the brain of awake monkeys, and we can train them to do certain tasks, and they will activate their brain regions, and we record these responses, as we call them. Now, another person who has been very influential in the work that I've been doing was Peter Marler. He came from quite a different direction of research. Neuroethology is the study of behavior of animals in relation to the neural systems that cause them. And Peter organized a conference in 1986, I believe, in Berlin on biology of learning, and a lot of famous people were there, and I was still a kind of a student or young scientist, and became fascinated by this question of how does language evolve from earlier systems, from more primitive systems in animals, especially non-human primates. And so we'll talk, about work that goes back to Peter Marler and his associates, and this is still a very lively direction of research. And then, of course, the third source of the third pillar that my work has been based on is the work of Leslie Ungerleider and Mort Mishkin. Mort was the person who actually invited me to the United States and to the NIH in the late 1980s, 1989 to be precise. And so he has had a profound influence on my career, obviously. Karl Pribram, who you see in the upper left of the slide, was the teacher of both Ungerleider and Mishkin. And he spent the last years of his life and of his academic career at Georgetown University, where I am now. And Karl has been a very sweet and very wonderful person to also discuss some of these ideas with me. Now, Ungerleider and Mishkin, by the way, Leslie passed away last year very suddenly and very sadly, whereas Mort is still alive at the age of 95 now. And, he's retired, obviously, but has worked in a whole career and got the Medal of Science from President Obama and so on, one of the most influential scientists in the whole world. And they figured out in the 80s that there were two cortical visual systems that deal with different functions. So starting out in the occipital cortex, V1 is the name that we all use for that. There are two streams that go into the parietal cortex and into the temporal cortex. Parietal cortex for spatial vision, temporal cortex for object vision. This is the detailed map that Leslie and her colleagues laid out at some point. You see there are many different specialized regions, but ultimately it's that dual stream that kind of determines the overall function of these two different visual systems. And that, when I started out to work on the processing of complex sounds in the monkey, I, of course, was influenced by this scheme in the visual system. And the question was, is maybe the auditory system is the basic modality for hearing and for speech and ultimately for language, even though, of course, there are sign languages that I'm not going to touch upon today, who work not on the basis of auditory information. But most of us speak a spoken language, and so the auditory domain is the one that has to interest us most as neurophysiologists. We want to ultimately understand speech and language. And as I said, and as I showed you that rhesus monkeys have a very rich communication system. I want to play you a few of these sounds that they make. I hope you can hear them well. And this is a coo here, for example. This is one of the most common contact calls that monkeys make when they see each other and greet each other. But then this is a growl, which you can kind of derive from the sound as a different function, stay away from me. And this is a bark, which is also more a noisy call acoustically. And so Mark Hauser, among others, who was a student of Peter Marlar's, characterized these calls, and he's written several books about it. And Peter himself, started all this and was really successful in categorizing some of these calls in both their acoustics and their behavioral function. Now compare that to human speech. I've only put up 1, 2, 3 examples, and but you see acoustically the two communication sounds groups that the monkey calls and the human speech do resemble each other. They have FM sweeps in there, and they have noisy portions in there. So this is information that we can use when we start to analyze, when we start to compare the two communication systems. Now, as we began to map auditory cortex, and this is looking through a microscope onto the surface of the auditory cortex in a rhesus monkey. It's a secondary auditory cortex. This is the lateral sulcus, which exists in humans and in most other mammals as the main location where you find your auditory cortex. And on the other side of that sulcus, there is a region called the lateral belt. It's a secondary region where we find responses to complex calls. This is an anesthetized monkey, so we were actually able to put a scale on there. These are the frequencies with which to which the neurons respond most vigorously, and so that was a start. And we then, went beyond the use of pure tones, which some people thought, was the fundamental stimulus for hearing, and started to use more complex sounds like bandpass tuning, a very sort of small change, but it makes a difference. If you stimulate a neuron like this with a bandpass noise burst, which is a kind of a noisy, stimulus, compared to the pure tones, then you get much better responses. This is the response to a bandpass noise burst compared to a pure tone. And then if you use an FM sweep up or down, then you get very selective responses. So what is plotted here is the number of spikes that we can record from a single neuron as we play these stimuli. And the peak here response that shows the best response of the neuron. And you can see that this is the best one, better than FM down, etc. So we kind of tried a lot of stimuli. We also tried communication calls themselves, and these are complex sounds, as you saw in the previous slide, and they differ quite a bit in structure. And some of the neurons love certain calls, but not others. So there's, I think, the basis. This is what we found as the basis of, neuronal basis of auditory communication, that there are neurons that respond better to one communication call than to another. And the question was then, how does that come about? How does the brain build these little machines that can then detect and process words, for example, and elements of speech in humans? And the little trick that the brain uses is called combination sensitivity. You combine the input of 3 of these sounds. They together make up a bark call, for example, and then connect them at the target neuron with an end gate. And so the neuron responds only to that call and not to anything else. And the same thing can be done in the time domain. You have these growls or bark calls, that have syllables, and you put them together with a delay and an end gate, and you have a detector for a growl call, for example. I put an asterisk after this term here because to remind me that the term goes back to Nobuo Suga, who was a famous neuroethologist, like as famous as Peter Mahler maybe, who studied echolocating bats. And the way echolocating bats find their target and their prey, so they send out a call, and then the echo comes back, and the brain of the bat receives that echo and connects the two together, the call and the echo, and measures the time difference. And that's how the bat can localize the insect and catch it. You know, so the same simple principles of putting together information from, in this case, the call system and the auditory system works in different ways. And that's quite fascinating. Now, people have recently discussed the question, so is there a difference between monkeys and humans in terms of how they process harmonic sounds? So our speech is a harmonic sound, and so are the monkey calls to a large extent, not all of them, but some of them are, like coo calls are harmonic sounds. So we did a study back in 2014 with Yuki Kikuchi as the first author, and Mort Mishkin was actually on the paper because he was interested in that question. Do monkeys have neurons that respond to harmonic sounds? And sure they do. You know, so here's an example of a harmonic complex tone, like a coo in a way. And this is the response of the neuron, where you see the bulk of the response is here at around 50 hertz or so. That's kind of the repetition frequency. But then you see these long-lasting harmonic responses to the harmonics of that call. So clearly there are representations in the brain of the monkey that register these calls as harmonic sounds. And it's nothing different from the human system. Now, recently, just 2 years ago, Norman Hegner and Camish and McDermott and Conway published a paper on that same question. They noticed that there are more such neurons in humans than in monkeys. And there are maybe specialized regions in the human brain. And this was done with functional MRI. So does it all boil down to quantity? Do we have more of these neurons in our brains than monkeys do? And maybe that's why we have speech and languages. It may be one of the differences, but I don't think it's the whole answer. But you know, this just to show you that this is a very active area of research still that is asking these same types of questions. And we found a number of other specializations in our studies. So the calls were one of them, and they were concentrated in this anterolateral region of the auditory cortex, the belt cortex. There were other regions that were specialized for example, space analysis, and this is coming back to the Angeleiter and Mishkin model of the what and where system. So there is something like a where pathway as well, and we'll talk about it more shortly. And but this is sort of summarizing the monkey part for the what we call the ventral stream that does the sound analysis or object analysis. Now, no system of or no question in neurobiology is complete without the anatomy. So neurophysiology is a lot of fun. You hear the brain cells at work. You know, you can hear the firing of the neurons as you record from these animals, and something that is rare in humans. There are, you know, human recordings being done by neurosurgeons, but it's not as easy, you know. It's not that it's easy in the monkey, but it is more accessible, let's put it that way, and more, you know, straightforward than doing neurophysiology in the human brain. So in humans, we're kind of left with indirect methods, imaging methods. And one thing that it's almost impossible to do in humans is tracer studies with neuroanatomical techniques. So we can inject traces, and this is one of the studies we did here, into these identified regions. This is the belt region that I've been talking about so far. We can put different anatomical traces into these regions and see what parts of the brain are connected to that. Where does auditory cortex project? And what we find is the same region in the inferior frontal cortex that is referred to as Broca's area in humans, and a few other regions more dorsally near the motor system. So these are premotor regions that also get input from the auditory system, but from a different region, from that where region or how region that we'll talk about in a minute. So this study incidentally was done by Liz Romansky, who was a postdoc in Goldman Rakic's lab at the time, and was a very nice collaboration that that laid the foundation for the anatomy of the higher auditory pathways in the monkey and in humans, as we'll see. So this is the first version of our dual stream model that was based on the physiology and on the anatomy. And you see these two streams, the what stream ventrally in the brain. Ventral means down, and dorsally, dorsal means up near the dorsum, the back of the brain, so to say. And the information comes in here through the lateral medial geniculate nucleus into the primary auditory cortex, into these different groups or sets of belt areas, and then, like in the visual system, projects up into the parietal cortex and into the temporal cortex, and comes together again in the prefrontal cortex. You know, what the prefrontal cortex is doing may be, of course, very important for language, as we'll see. And then this is the sort of the centerpiece of the talk, you could say, the dual stream model that originated from our studies with Sophie Scott and Ina Bornkessel and many others. And so this is the dual stream model that we are proposing, that we're still working on, that we're still filling all the gaps. But again, you see the two projections originating from auditory cortex into the inferior frontal cortex. This is Broca's area, and into parietal cortex. Part of it, and this has been a matter of a long debate, part of the projection is direct from auditory cortex to prefrontal cortex. And so, some people have kind of debated this, whether, or have suggested that what's called the arcuate fasciculus in humans is special to humans, and that this is the basis for language, as opposed to communication in monkeys. Angela Federici, for example, has been a proponent of that idea. Again, we have projections in the monkey that go directly from the auditory cortex to prefrontal cortex. Maybe not, to this region right there, but it's a debate of what the homologies are between the monkey and the human. But clearly, there is a direct projection from temporal to prefrontal cortex, and then it boils down to a question of quantity again. Like I said, with the complex sounds in the temporal cortex. Here it's a question: is the arcuate fasciculus, as it's commonly called in humans, is that sparser in the monkey? And I would give you that. There's probably, there's a recent paper that came out from Chris Petkoff's group that shows clearly it's there in both species, but it's probably richer and has more fibers in humans than in monkeys. So that's still a very interesting question that needs to be debated. And just want to sort of put your attention to the red text here. Ventral stream, again, hierarchical processing, object identification, as I've described it so far. And now we're turning to the dorsal stream, which is, to me now, that catches most of my interest, because the ventral stream has sort of been worked out in theoretically both in the visual system and in the auditory system. We have this hierarchical processing, object processing, and so on. It's just a matter of time until we really understand what's going on. We need to understand the back projections from prefrontal and premotor down here, but overall, I think we have a good idea of how this works. Whereas the dorsal stream still needs a lot of work. It has elements of space processing, as I mentioned, but it is more than that. It's a sensory motor integration machine. That's what it is. And it is a controller for internal models. And this is what I'd like to get into now in the second part of my talk. So we're talking about, actually, let me add some evidence for what I just said, but we'll also get into the dorsal stream at the same time, for how the monkey and the human compare. This is what I've already told you about the ventral stream. We see that there are, the same kind of core belt, parabelt areas in humans. This was a study together with Max Riesenhuber and a student of ours using fMRI. There is a specialized region that is good for when you play musical instruments and speech sounds, they get separated. So, that's actually quite an important finding, you would think. And that's been backed up by studies from the same group at MIT that I mentioned earlier, Norman McNair and Richard McDermott. Josh McDermott is someone who has also worked with Mark Hauser in the past on communication calls. So he comes from the same tradition. And they kind of confirm that there are different regions in the temporal cortex for music processing and speech processing. So, kind of confirming what we would have predicted from the monkey work. And finally, I kind of moved this up a little bit in my talk, so might as well mention this study that a student of mine did. Ian DeWitt is a meta-analysis of a number of imaging studies that have come out in the last 20 years. He found this really nice progression from more regions that are closer to primary auditory cortex to all the way almost to the temporal pole, where the early areas are important for processing of phonemes. Then the next region is processing words, and finally we're processing phrases and short sentences in the most anterior region of the brain, of the temporal lobe. And so that again was a very nice confirmation in the human of the monkey data of the hierarchical processing chain in the superior temporal cortex of the ventral stream. And kind of necessitates a little bit of rewriting of the textbooks, because Wernicke's area in this case has been located mostly in the posterior region of superior temporal, and we kind of moved it more anteriorly. And now we get to the question, so what are these two famous language areas, the Broca's area and Wernicke's area, what are they really doing? If Wernicke's area is not really, or let's put it that way, if the Wernicke's area is not that far posterior, if it is more anterior, and it becomes part of the ventral stream, then what is the dorsal side of the superior temporal cortex doing? Now we find it there. Dorsal stream is doing audio motor integration, whatever that means. And it connects the auditory regions with the motor regions. And this is what we really need in order to do something like speech production. If you have a little baby, for example, learning to speak, and this was one of the big motivators for me as well when I started to dabble in linguistics, is that I have two sons, and when they were born, these, it was so fascinating to observe how they started to learn language and how they learned to speak. And so I actually started a diary, like I'm sure a lot of parents do, and wrote down, what happened each day. And unfortunately, one of these diaries got lost in a moving van accident when I moved to the United States. But nevertheless, you know, there's a lot of sources that you can find for these relation of cooing in little babies. So they produce sounds that you could talk, that you could call precursors of language or speech. There's babbling is the next phase. We're all familiar with that. You know, when it becomes more and more similar to phonemes and to speech sounds. And the monkeys have a cooing phase also. Baby monkeys are famous for their contact calls. All ornithologists, there's a whole literature out there on communication calls and baby monkeys. But the difference is that they don't have a real, you know, productive babbling phase where they suddenly start to speak. You know, they start to make their communication calls, but it stays at a less complex level than, you know, in human babies who suddenly start to speak, and they suddenly say words, and they suddenly say sentences after a while. So what's the difference? What keeps the monkeys from acquiring speech and language? So this is kind of the same question that we ask in evolution. Now we're asking it in ontogeny. What is happening, what's not happening? And now we have to get into these kind of complex models, and people like Danny Wolpert and Michael Jordan and Karato and a lot of theoreticians have, and there's a lot of math, which I won't show you, have dealt with these internal model ideas. That, you know, how do you put together a system that can make a complex movement on the basis of sensory information? So in the speech system, we have an auditory input, obviously, that we have to somehow connect to the motor system, because, you know, we want to ultimately produce the same sounds that we hear. This is the whole point of a species-specific communication system. It happens in birds. You know, birdsong is a fantastic system also to study local communication in an animal model. And that field is wonderful, and has come a long way. And there are many similarities that have been identified between monkeys and birds, and birds and humans. So I think this is a trifecta of work that should be brought together at some point. And Eric Jarvis's work, for example, is wonderful, and they're going into the genetics now. And I think it's very exciting. So in the monkeys and in humans, we have similar building blocks here. So from the auditory system, we go up the ventral stream, the auditory objects, we've already heard about this, and we're also going up the dorsal stream. And ultimately, the auditory information reaches parietal cortex and premotor cortex. And when we say a word, or when the baby babbles and you know, tries to say a word, it will go this route into the motor cortex. The motor cortex will innervate the brainstem neurons that are responsible for the articulators to do their work and produce the sounds through our larynx. But in between is this system, which is called an emulator, or sometimes simulator. Emulator, I think, is the better expression. And a controller here that is learning to close the loop. And so there's of course, the term efference copy is probably familiar to most of you. There is a copy of the controller signal, the motor signal, is being sent back into the sensory system in order to teach. And but this is sort of very general. We need to do this more quantitatively, and we need to do this in a more theoretical fashion to sort of find the experimental data that then are testable in order to test the model. So here's a very simplified dorsal stream, starting out with the posterior regions of the auditory cortex. This is where people used to put Wernicke's area. It's probably, it is an auditory region, of course, in both in monkeys and in humans, and it projects to parietal cortex and to frontal cortex, and it goes back and forth. There's a forward projection, a back projection, and this is important because the back projection is the one that delivers the information to the auditory cortex and vice versa. The auditory cortex delivers information to the motor system, and this is how the predicted sensory consequences are communicated, and this is how the motor commands are then programmed out of the desired sensory consequences. So the loop between the temporal and the frontal cortex works both ways. It's essential to think of it as a two-way communication system. And here's an example. This is then the effector system, the motor system, how we actually make sounds, make speech sounds. Of course, our lips are important. Our jaw is important when we produce vowels, and the tongue is most important of all. And this is so nicely visualized in recent MRI movies that can be made now. This was a technique was originally invented in Germany, the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen, but also now used at in Los Angeles at not UCLA, it's one of the places there. And anyway, here's a movie of my cursor gets lost every now and then. Not only speaking, but also singing. Anyway, if you haven't seen this, I'm sure you're going to be stunned when I first saw this, and you can actually watch the work of the articulators and the brain. Essentially, you just need to add an MRI and sort of look at brain activity at the same time. But you can imagine how the motor system innervates these articulators, and this is the machine that we need to understand. How does the brain program movements so articulate that they are reproducible and can be used over and over again reliably in communicating information through this? It's a crazy system if you think about it, but this is what nature has come up with in evolution. And same thing happened in music, of course. Robert Satori had this nice slide a few years ago when he learned to play the violin. It's also communication between the motor cortex and the auditory cortex. And this is from my home state of Bavaria here. Listen to that for hours and hours, but if you just, this is sort of like learning an instrument like this is sort of like learning to speak. You have to hit the right buttons, and in order to produce what you actually want to produce, what you want to produce. That little boy has heard that melody many times from his father, and he's able to reproduce it by pressing the right buttons with his motor system. So it's really, a total analogy for the speech system. And now, what about monkeys? Let's go back to the monkeys now. And can they do something like this? And I thought they might. And so we built this behavioral apparatus. Monkeys have been tested with button pressing many times. This is sort of standard behavioral work that has been done with monkeys in Japan. They've trained monkeys to press buttons and learn sequences. So I thought, why not hook up these buttons to a computer that can actually produce sounds? So then we have an audio motor system that we can test. And even though the monkeys can't speak, so maybe they can at least learn to produce melodies or sound sequences that they've been taught. And so this is what it looks like. And this is one of our monkeys who's learned it now. Say to that. So he can play the piano, and if you haven't seen enough, I can show you another example. Earlier one, slower melody. So they can do that. Maybe not a huge surprise. These kind of tasks have been done before, but now we're doing functional MRI, and now we're looking at the brain, that which parts of the brain are lighting up when the monkey learns or performs the task. And surprise, surprise, you actually get activity in the motor cortex when the monkey simply listens to these melodies. So this is not while he's performing. We're going to do that too, and we'll compare the activity during motor production and just listening. But the important point here is that this is an auditory representation in motor cortex that we found, and it is specific for the melody that the monkey learned. So here SP means the learned melody, and NSP means the non-learned melody. And what you see is activation in the central sulcus, where the motor cortex is, to some extent premotor cortex as well. And the part of the motor cortex that's activated is the arm region. This is based on data from Martelli and Lupino. Like you saw in the early slide of Penfield's work, the monkey motor cortex, since some of the motor cortex is organized the same way as the human in terms of topography of monculus. So the face region is down at the bottom, the legs are up on the top, and the arm region is somewhere in between. So it's that arm region that the monkeys activate when they learn to play, but also when they simply listen to these same melodies. And another region that was very interesting that lit up was the putamen in the basal ganglia. So in both monkeys, we get activation in the basal ganglia. And basal ganglia are known for learning of sequences. So this is probably where the sequence information is stored and learned. And there are other data from Earl Miller's lab, for example, that would confirm that this is sort of the early stage, and then it goes up into the cortex and gets memorized there. And now what we're doing is, this work just got funded by NIH for another 5 years. And what we promised in that grant application is that now we're going to go in with microelectrodes into these regions that we know, these monkeys are still alive. And we can put electrodes in there and record from single neurons as the monkey is listening or performing. We can figure out the difference between perception and production in that way. And Jess Jacobs, who was a student in my lab, graduate student, has already gotten a lot of preliminary data. You can see when we play the melody that the neurons are firing here. That's where the arrows are pointing in motor cortex when they're listening to an auditory sequence. So these are auditory neurons in motor cortex. And this is now the internal model that I've been talking about. And we see auditory and motor responses in M1, primary motor cortex. So here's an auditory response, clearly, very nice and reliable. And then a little later comes the motor response. So there is probably different populations of neurons involved, and they may be sitting in different cortical layers. And this is what we are now trying to figure out. How is the exact precise laminar distributions of these auditory motor neurons in M1 or in premotor cortex, and how are they learned? How do they come about? And if we record from these monkeys at different stages of learning and development, we can figure out, I hope, how the laminar distribution and the projections from auditory to motor cortex are organized. Same thing here. There's an example that just got from the melody that was specifically learned, and as a control, there's no significant response. Although there is, the projection has to be there, so the auditory information in the fibers projecting from auditory to motor will be there. They just have to be, their synapses, their synaptic connections basically have to be tuned. And now we go back to the human one more time. One slide here from Eddie Chang's work at UCSF, who does do recordings in humans. And he finds the same thing in humans. There is, when people listen to speech, for example, they do activate motor cortex as well. Here's the activation in auditory cortex, as you would expect, but here's some activation in motor cortex when they just listen to speech. And of course, during speaking, they activate it more. So there's motor and auditory representations in human motor cortex as well. And we're talking to Eddie a lot about this, of course. So finally, I've arrived at the paper that Ina and I did together a couple of years ago. And since I'm out of time, basically, I think I've asked Ina whether she would like to take over and explain the study that we did in those days, 2015. So it's been, time flies incredibly. And she's the linguist here, and she can tell you how this all relates to real language. So I will skip these slides. Do you want me to leave it on, Ina? Do you have them yourself? Can you show them? Because otherwise, I'm just going to show the pictures of my students and postdocs who did the real work here. Michael Ortiz developed the fMRI in the monkeys. Dennis Archikov trained the monkeys to play the piano. Josie Ding helped him. She's now in Belgium doing her PhD. Jess Jacobs did the recordings, and Pavel Kushmarek kept the lab together. He's now at NIH as a staff scientist working with Betsy Murray. And the MRI team who worked on the humans was Amber Lever, who was in the lab for many years as a graduate student, Ian DeWitt, who found the progression in the ventral stream from phonemes to words, and Marc Chevier did a number of other studies, like showing the core belt organization in humans that we had found in the monkey, and John Vermeer is director of our imaging center. So thanks to all of them, and thanks to the former collaborators, Biao Tian, who was in my lab for many years. Mort Mishkin, you might not be able to see his face actually, because there's some of the pictures are over that region here. Pat Goldman passed away in a traffic accident several years ago. Les Romansky, who did the injections, and Jonathan Fritz, who was helpful in many ways in several studies that we collaborated on while we were both at NIH. And Tim Pons, unfortunately, passed away so prematurely, who was one of the great neuroanatomists and who helped us with the tracer experiments as well. And the funding here, of course, NIH, both NIDCD and NINDS was interested and still interested in that, and NSF and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, who financed, an Humboldt Prize, Humboldt Award, which is also, went into some of these endeavors. So, Ina, would you like to take over from here, or how is this planned?
Thank you very much, Professor Haushecker, for this enlightening talk. Now we will start the discussion with invited discussant, Professor Ina Bornkessel-Shilezewski. Professor Bornkessel-Shilezewski is a professor of cognitive neuroscience and director of Universities of South Australia Center for Cognitive and Systems Neuroscience. Thanks, Professor Bornkessel-Shilezewski.
Good morning, everyone from Australia. Thanks very much, Miguel, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Joseph, thank you so much for a fascinating talk, and lovely to see you. It's been too long.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, it's interesting that you've sort of asked me to take over, because in a way, this sort of touches on the question that I was actually going to ask as well, because I guess, you know, one of the things that a linguist will usually sort of be wondering about when they listen to your fascinating work, and the, you know, the many similarities between the sort of auditory processing in monkeys and speech processing in humans. It does sort of leave that question of, well, but what happens when we try to look at sort of higher order language, right? What happens when we try to figure out this sort of, I guess, wicked question to a certain extent, how human language allows us to combine meaningful units to sort of form these ever new and complex meanings. And indeed, we did offer some thoughts on that in 2015. I mean, I don't want to take up a lot of time to sort of talk about this, but one thing I'd actually really like to ask you about, following, you know, some of the work that we did back then, where we were sort of suggesting, for example, with regard to the ventral stream, that these auditory objects could scale up to become more complex, of course, building on the work that you did with Ian DeWitt and others. One thing I thought that was really interesting that you mentioned during our talk was you said at one point, the ventral stream has been worked out. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Because I get that, you know, we understand a lot about how this sort of auditory object processing works, but do you think we really already know how the combination of these auditory objects to more complex objects works? I mean, there's a lot of work that people like, you know, Lena Pilkinen's group in New York are doing to look at sort of combinatorics in the anterior temporal lobe. But yeah, I'm just curious, could you maybe just elaborate a little bit as to why you say you know, ventral stream, done and dusted, we know how that works?
Yeah, no, of course, that was a very provocative remark. Of course, it hasn't been worked out yet, but I think we're a little farther along than with the dorsal stream. And, you know, we've gotten a lot of pointers actually from the visual system. You know, I've worked on the visual system for many years before sort of going into the more difficult auditory system. And, you know, work of Max Riesenhuber and Tommy Poggio, for example, they had a model in the 90s about inferotemporal cortex and about object processing in the visual system. And that's still a very, you know, a great model that is, you know, is being tested and is being elaborated on. And you know, so this is something that we have to lean on in the auditory system, and I believe really that it is working very similarly. What neither modality has worked out yet is the semantics, for example. You know, so there's one point that obviously is still quite open. We know that there's, you know, we actually, Max and I just wrote a grant together on this, in, you know, to work out how the interaction between the anterior regions of the superior temporal cortex interact with the VLPFC, the ventrolateral part of the prefrontal cortex. You know, obviously there has to be some shuttle going back up and down, and you might have noticed that my arrows were all, you know, had, you know, arrows on both sides, you know, so it's not just a one-way street, as it might seem when you talk about a hierarchical system. There's obviously information being exchanged both ways. And this is also, I think, how the combinatorics would work, that you would have to sort of tie together elements of an idea, of an object. You know, it starts at the syllable level. You know, if you want to create a word out of several syllables, you need to tie together the components, and that, you know, that's actually part of the hierarchical idea, is that you kind of tie together, bind together lower order elements with higher order elements, but then you have the projection that goes back down again. So there's still work to do, but I think, you know, because we have the lead from the visual system, I think there's something that we can kind of neurobiologically kind of build upon.
And so do you think that similarly to what some people have sort of argued for the visual system that you get this, this very fast sort of initial forward sweep that then sort of influences the whole system sort of working back down the hierarchy. So you're basically saying we should expect to see that in the auditory system as well.
Yeah,
is there
that's
any,
very attractive.
do we have any empirical evidence that that's actually happening?
Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. The dynamics of these systems has certainly not been fully explored, I have to say. What we're trying to do, one of the things that we actually proposed in that grant application that we just submitted, so it's kind of fresh in my mind, is to use multiple electrode arrays, where you can record from different regions in the auditory cortex, or in auditory cortex and prefrontal cortex at the same time. That's really what we need in terms of technological approaches to sort of understand this exchange of information between different levels. And then we're also going to use laminar electrodes that that will be able to tell us, give us information about where, microscopic information really, which lamina in each cortex contributes to the feed forward and to feedback in the system.
And what are your thoughts on the people who sort of continue to critique dual stream models? There's always these responses to sort of say, well, that was a nice model, but now we sort of know that's too simplistic, and there's interactions that sort of branch out much further than that, and then there's the subcortical connections. But nevertheless, you still seem very convinced that this is the model that we want to stick to.
These critiques were there from the very beginning. I remember when we first published it, the first couple of papers, there was a commentary from John Kaas even, who was a big supporter of the idea, but he also said, well, maybe there's a third stream, and maybe there's, and that's been said about the Ungerleider-Mishkin model from the very beginning. It's still being said about them, and Leslie herself said, well, maybe there's a third stream for motion, which is sort of contributes into the object processing as well as form from motion, as well as the spatial processing. And now people are talking about a social processing stream, for social perception, which is a very hot topic right now with Jim Haxby and many others working on that. I think, I'm not married to the idea there's only two streams, but I think it's sort of something to work with. There may be substreams or streamlets. We actually sort of wrote a response to that Kaas, and actually Balain Sartori wrote another one. So it's been debated from the very beginning. Is there two streams or multiple streams? I think what's important is that there are groups of processing families, if you want, where because what I still would maintain is that pattern processing or object processing is a whole different thing from in an internal model. A sensory motor model is something totally different from determining what an object is. So I think that distinction will hold up.
And is that then where you see the connection to the sort of modules or different subsystems that you mentioned at the beginning? Because to me that's quite interesting, because of course there are these, in a way, sort of subsystems that are being proposed in this sort of approach, right? Like, as you said, sort of a different stream or system for recognizing objects as opposed to processing these internal models. But on the other hand, that that doesn't map very neatly necessarily onto, say, the sorts of modules that Fodor or others would have proposed from a linguistic perspective. So and that's something, as you know, that I've been working on for a long time as well. So sort of saying, well, can we actually neatly map these linguistic distinctions onto the brain? Or is that a problem?
That's why I was hoping you would accept to be the discussant, because this is what you've done. Exactly. Yeah, of course. Fodor, I think he was very influential as one of the first books in cognitive science that I wrote, that I read as a student. If you read the book carefully, there is actually a reference to neurobiology. He's sort of the prototypical cognitive scientist who doesn't care about the brain, is what people think. I think he did relate his work to the brain, and there's sort of interesting pointers. They may not all be correct, but there are references to Zecchi's work, who was really the first one to talk about functional specialization in the visual system. And going back to Brodmann, there's now a new classification happening through Van Essen's work, for example, and I think that will slowly take over the Brodmann terminology, but because it's based on more detailed information. So we have this mosaic, anatomically based, chemically based in the brain, and I think comprising some of these really minute subsystems will help. If we can organize them into kind of families or larger subsystems, that will help than dealing with with the molecular architecture, which is important too, of course. So you have to use both levels of observation depending on the question that you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the challenge is always that mapping problem, right? How do you map, whether it's cognition or language, what's the right level of description to map onto the brain? And I guess we're still trying to figure out how to best approach that problem. And I actually had a discussion with someone the other day, not about language. This was just actually about how to do cognitive assessments. And the question was, what's the, what's the smallest unit of cognition that you might be able to map onto neurobiology? And it's still, I guess, a problem that continues to fascinate me, but I'm still not entirely sure that we have the answer how to work that out. I guess all we can sort of try to do is approach the problem from both sides, as you were saying, and at different levels, and sort of try to converge on the best sort of levels of description, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, but it's I think it's necessary to have this exchange of ideas between all these levels. I think when we talk about the mind and the brain, we I guess we do mean the same thing, that the mind is what comes out of the brain, what's the emerging accomplishment of what the brain does. And so I think this is the difference between cognitive science and neuroscience in some ways, but I think neuroscience is certainly well behooved to look at these cognitive models as well. And we haven't even talked about the real mathematical models in terms of the internal models. There's a lot of math behind that, which I didn't bring up. But I think control theory is something that we need to bring into the story and pay attention to if you want to understand this whole I think this, to me, this is the biggest question in language research at the moment, at least. How do language or speech, even at the level of speech perception systems interact with speech production systems? Leaving out the grammar for the moment, but maybe you can say more on that, actually. From our paper that we wrote together. How does grammar?
I mean, I guess the way I would view this is that there is this quite close link between this notion of internal models and the very sort of pervasive idea of predictive coding as a as sort of unifying theory of the brain across lots of different domains. And that, of course, also, at least in the sort of the mainstream view, if you like, encompasses this notion that we have this hierarchically organized system of these predictive models, with predictions being sort of passed down the hierarchy and matched against input, and then the prediction error sort of being propagated up the hierarchy. And to me, I mean, I know not everybody sees it this way, but to me, that is quite a compelling model, and I think it's quite a nice model to try to explain how language can function in quite a similar way to other cognitive systems in the brain. And it also has the potential ability to sort of bridge these different levels, right? From the phoneme, or the sound, potentially right up to these more complex units, because these models can sort of scale up in terms of their sort of temporal windows that they integrate. So I think that literature, as it continues to sort of explore how internal generative models and internal predictive models might be able to be used to explain all sorts of aspects of cognition, I think as we learn more about that, we'll hopefully be able to sort of apply that to language as well. So I think it's in a way a similar approach to what you've been pursuing for many years. Mm.
Yeah, no, and I would still subscribe to that view, and I think this is something again where the dual stream model is useful, because you have those two sort of complementary modes of processing that, and especially the dorsal stream has been underestimated. And I think, well, it hasn't, in the early days when people thought this is only about space processing, but it became clear pretty quickly that the sensory motor transformation is really what's happening there. And you can apply that to not just sound or vision, you can apply it to cognitive processes just as well, as you pointed out in that 2015 paper.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess on a slightly different note, one other thing I'm sort of curious about is sort of the relation between language and music. And I know that you touched upon this a little bit, but obviously I know that you have a whole sort of other field of research as well, where you look at music in more detail, and just wanted to sort of pick up on two sort of different things that you mentioned during your talk. On the one hand, you sort of talked about some distinct sort of regions for music and speech, but at the same time you also said learning an instrument is like learning to speak. So how do you feel about the ability to study music, how that might sort of impact on our understanding of language? Because of course there's a lot of people like Stefan Koch and others who've sort of looked at the similarities and potential differences between language and music for a long time. How what's your view?
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit on that. That's great that you bring that up, and I've given talks that emphasize the music part, rather than language part. The big conference on brain bases of music. I don't remember the exact title, in Boston every other year or so, and I've spoken there, and the commonality was mostly the piece by Michael Wolle, the Wagner aria that I played today.
That was fantastic.
Use that for both.
I'm going to look that up.
He speaks and he sings at the same time. But I know it's a controversial subject. Not everybody would subscribe to the idea that speech and music are so similar and are so related. And two camps, I think, that would certainly maintain that music has almost nothing to do with speech. But I think there are, as a neurophysiologist, that is sort of a more generalist that I am, I think one can make that, one can see these parallels for sure. Not only is it the auditory modality, but when you look at a violin player, I intentionally put that slide in from Robert Sartorius' work, who's worked, of course, for decades on that question, how is music represented, and you have a different effector system, obviously, when you learn to play the violin, or when you play the organ, where you actually use your feet as well, as an effector system. But they all have to move in certain ways, and that's where the internal model comes in again. In order to produce a sound or a sound sequence that you want to produce and that the others want to hear, that you want to, so it's that's where the commonality is. And obviously there is more to music than just playing the correct melody, and but that's the violin players have to learn first. That's the first step, that they master that, and kind of often painful to listen to beginners, play the violin because they can't even hit the note, But once you pass that, then of course there's a lot of other information that you have to pay attention to. And I remember a conversation in a group with Lang Lang here in DC. He came to the Kennedy Center and gave a great concert, and afterwards he made himself available for a discussion. And we talked about all these kind of things. And the little boys came up and asked, how long have you practiced when you were starting this? And he would say, 15 hours a day. And it's a difficult thing to become a famous pianist, so it needs a lot of practice. And the other thing that he said, which was so interesting, is that when he knows a piece really well, when the piece basically plays itself, is what he actually said.
Mm-hmm.
And then he puts up a different screen in his brain, where he can add the color and where he can add different feelings. And every time he plays the same piece, he might play it differently. At least that's what he thinks. And what I think you can see, certainly, you don't often have the opportunity to see Lang Lang on different evenings, but I'm sure if people, famous soloists can do that they bring out different things on different days. And so, we can do that in language too. I guess there's emotion, of course, in language and speech and again, but so I don't want to kind of I want to emphasize the commonalities rather than differences here, I think.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you just mentioned, those additional layers, I guess, those sort of, those, the emotion and the different sort of facets that at least a professional musician might bring in, because that sort of reminds me of a discussion that I remember from, must be about sort of 15 years or so ago now, in regard to looking at music and the extent to which you could actually look at some sort of semantics or meaning processing in music, which then sort of, ties back to what you were saying earlier, that we still haven't really figured out how the semantics work in terms of, we sort of know a little bit about how sequences are processed and maybe how things are combined, but not so much about the meaning. Do you think, how do you feel about semantics in music?
Yeah, wow, that's a pretty big one. If I'm not the ultimate Wagner fanatic, but I like some of his music. But he always, and it's actually not just Wagner. There's a lot of composers who've debated in their music that they've written, or in the operas that they've written. What's the primacy? What should have primacy? Is it the music or is it the libretto? So Capriccio, for example, is an opera by Richard Strauss where this is being debated, and there are several others. And does the composer write the music first, and then somebody finds the words to go with it, or is it the libretto that it starts and that starts the opera, and then the composer has to find the right music that goes with the. And I think it works both ways, and it's often difficult to say, but I think the best operas are always those that where the two are in harmony with each other, and whether it's the same person like Wagner, wrote his own librettos, and whereas Richard Strauss worked with Hofmannsthal, who was a famous writer, and they both understood each other's art. Hofmannsthal understood Strauss's music, and an opera like Rosenkavalier is just a perfect opera for me because everything comes together. So that's sort of
that's a good point.
Sort of my personal feeling.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure how much time we have and at what point we should start actually.
You need Miguel to
taking questions from the audience, because I mean, very happy to keep talking, and I'm sure we could keep talking for a long time, but
we have enough time.
Miguel, we have enough time? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
If you do it another 10 minutes at least, then we have an hour and a half total. I think that would be.
Sure.
We can go on until 3. That's fine. But then you're gonna be what's the time right now at your place?
It's almost 4 o'clock.
Oh
So
my God.
yeah.
You want to go to bed at some point, I suppose.
I got a few hours of sleep earlier, so I'll be okay. No, all good. So yeah, I guess
I mean,
something else that I found it.
If we had the opportunity to talk to the audience, I would like to know really from them the feedback that I was would be hoping for is, is this attempt to study this in the monkey, study speech and language in the monkey, or the basics of that. Is that a meaningful attempt? Going back to Francis Crick's question, the trouble with language is that there's no animal model. And that's why he decided not to study language, period, because he didn't think there was a way to study this, in a brain system that can be studied with our techniques, with electrophysiology and with anatomy and so on. So basically, he gave up all hope, to understand language at that level. And so, do we have a chance even to do it if we try to do it the way I was proposing?
Yeah, and I guess the maybe while we're waiting on questions from the audience or comments, I guess one of the things that it comes down to is whether you believe, say, the Chomskyan perspective, that there was this, this sort of giant leap, that there was some sort of disconnect between, say, non-human primates and humans, that then, just like a jump that then suddenly made language possible. And I guess if you believe that, then it makes it a bit more difficult to find a suitable animal model, right? Because you sort of think something has happened that makes the brain different, or sufficiently different that we maybe can't find at least not the key precursor mechanism. But I
mean, if you listen to if you read the literature on birdsong, for example, it's the same situation there, that they identify a homologue of the cortex, auditory cortex, as one of the substrates, motor cortex, obviously, and the basal ganglia. So if you read, I read one of Eric Jarvis's recent papers, down to the molecular biology, there's a lot of similarity between all 3 species. I think one should really work on all 3 species: humans, birds, and monkeys, and find what the commonality is and what's the missing piece. I think it's maybe even more important to find find the missing piece, in order to, and then ask. Obviously, sign languages, their importance is well taken. There's no question that it's important to know that there are different sensory modalities that can do the job. We don't absolutely depend on audition. There's, maybe, other ways to express our thoughts and our meanings. But if we just sort of look at audition for the moment, what is it that what is added in the human brain that is missing in the monkey, or in the songbird? And I think that's something we haven't figured out yet. But in order to do that, I think we need a close conversation between the linguists and the neurobiologists. And I know that's hard, but that's what this series is trying to do, I think, as well.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of sort of trying to look at the sort of the non-human primate models in combination with the bird song models, and sort of trying to see what commonalities there are, and as you said, trying to sort of see, well, what, even when we look at all of that, what is still missing, what can't we explain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
do you know of,
sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, do you know, have there been any attempts to sort of integrate those models over the
I had, when
recent years?
Unfortunately, Alison Doak passed away so early. We were talking about all these people that that died prematurely. Alison was well on her way. She wrote this really seminal review with Pat Cool on comparing bird songs and humans, and I think she would have pursued that avenue. I was talking to her a lot, and she was also at this conference, a Darwin conference in Berlin that I mentioned, that Peter Mahler organized in the biology of learning. What we have going for us in the monkey world, is that the brains are really so similar. You can, there's no question usually what the homologies are. There is the central sulcus, that even the gross anatomy of the human and non-human primates' brains are so similar that we can really relate one brain to the other quite easily. But the frontal cortex is bigger. Okay, I'll give you that. And John Cass again did a lot of work on the evolution of the brain in non-human primates, and for that's what's more difficult in the bird brain. That it's sometimes not straightforward to draw the analogies. What is the homology of the putamen, for example, and even at the cortical level, and they had to rename some of their brain structures a couple of times to make the homologies more obvious. And Harvey Carton did a lot of work on that, and really important work. But then again, songbirds learn their melodies from their fathers, so there's clearly teaching involved and learning involved, which is not so obvious in monkeys. And so from that point of view, maybe the songbird is a good model. And that's why I think we all have to talk to each other more. Find
yeah, absolutely. And then there's some interesting work coming out of places like Zurich, for example, where they look at, animal communication systems more generally, right? And looking at things like at least some sort of basic systems of combinatorics in, it's been a little while since I looked at the details, but studying meerkats and I think also certain kind of monkey species where they're actually trying to do some quite detailed work, in collaboration with the researchers who sort of study the animal behavior in collaboration with the linguists there, which I think could be quite interesting to sort of take in combination with this more neurobiological literature to sort of try to see, not only in terms of, I guess, potential sort of processing operations in the brain, but also, what can you observe in terms of animal communication?
Bring it back to the behavioral level as well. Yeah, this is sort of the ethological approach that I like so much.
Right.
And if you talk to people like Jonathan Fritz or to Tecumseh Fitch, they have an immense knowledge on that. And Mark Hauser is also still interested in these kinds of questions. This is a very good point. Even within sort of a larger species of the primates, you can see differences, and it should be possible to identify brain systems that mark these behavioral differences as well. That's a very good point.
Yeah, but I think it's also a good a good point to reiterate that we should we sort of all need to talk to each other, don't we?
Yeah.
Which is harder than it sounds sometimes.
And I hope the real in-person conferences are coming back after this COVID crisis. I miss that. This is nice to be on Zoom together, but it's definitely nicer to actually sit around a table and discuss this and then have things become emotional. This is one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Miguel, I can see you in the other window. Are you?
Yes. So we are coming to an end of this excellent talk and discussion. So thank you very much once again, Professor Hauschecker and Professor Bornkessel-Silesensky for your collaboration with the Abralinha ao Vivo series. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to continue watching our Abralinha ao Vivo series. Thank you very much for the participation of everyone, and until next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for inviting me and for this opportunity to present our ideas. Thank you so much, and all this. I wish you all the success for this fascinating lecture series. It's really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nina.
Thanks very much also from me. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Really